and maybe we'll get started, and hopefully more people will come in. Good morning, everyone. My name's Casey La Rochelle. I'm zooming in today from Nanaimo territory. I'm from the Haisla Nation myself, but I grew up here in Nanaimo. I'm with administration and strategic partnerships within Finesse, and I kind of support funding and projects and the Indigenous circle and programming. I'll start off with asking people to just briefly introduce yourself and any expectations of the meeting, starting with Kathy Robinson.
Good morning, I'm Kathy Robinson here in Hartley Bay. I am the new Emergency Program Coordinator.
Thank you very much. Lucas Veltri.
Good morning. My name is Lucas Veltri. I'm the Emergency Program Coordinator for the New Hawk Nation located out in what is known as Bella Coola. Looking forward to learning about the different programs available.
Great. Good to see some coastal bands here. Edward Robinson.
I'm Edward Robinson, Director of Emergency for Gitgat First Nation in Hartley Bay.
Thank you very much. Quentin Boyce.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Quentin Boyce. I am the new Emergency Services Coordinator for the Williams Lake First Nation.
Thank you. C. Marchand. Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Colleen Marchand. I'm with the Okanagan Indian Band in Vernon, BC. I am the SORTA EPC. I'm the Director of Territorial Stewardship and then managing the EPC folder as well. And really just interested to see what funding's available and opportunities that we have. We've had response to emergencies since 2017 every year, floods and fires. So looking to see how we can help the community.
Thank you very much. Tom Duncan, you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Duncan. Yeah, I'm with CIRNAC and I'm with the First Nation Adapt program. So I'm one of the presenters today. And yeah, so happy to be here.
And you're based where, Tom?
I'm in Ottawa.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see Anthony Hadfield on there. Anthony, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Anthony Hadfield. I'm the Regional Manager for Emergency Management for Indigenous Services Canada here in BC region. And I'm honoured today to be coming from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you so much for agreeing to present. I see Rochelle Orman. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm a senior engineer in the Community Infrastructure Directorate of Indigenous Services, and I sit in the Specialist Services group.
Good to see you, Rochelle. The one and only Diane Kay from Finesse. Diane, are you still on there? Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, yes. Diane Keeler and with Finesse as well. And I am really interested in this program because we're going to spend a bit more time helping with recovery. So I need to get all the information I can get about what's available for funding. Thanks, Casey.
Thank you. Next, we have Jenna Noppen.
Good morning, everybody. Recovery Manager, Grants Officer, and EPC for CIRNAC.
Thank you so much. Juan.
Did you say Juan?
Yeah, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan Sereno. I carry the name Wichun from the Nlaka'pamux territory. I'm currently the Emergency Operations Center Director for Tsleil-Waututh First Nation and a Special Program Manager for the community. I'm particularly interested in capacity development funding. I recently noticed that there has been expressions of interest to develop evacuation facilities in the province. And although we may have the space to build those, we don't have them built. So I'm interested in learning more about what's going to be available or what is available to develop the capacity in our communities.
Thank you very much for joining us. Stephen McGlenn.
Good morning, everyone. Stephen McGlenn. I'm the Director of Lands and Natural Resources Governance for Lacamo First Nation, and I'm also the Emergency Operations Center Director. Today, I'm obviously very interested in learning about available funds, and I would just briefly like to convey, reading in the news recently, a parliamentary committee, found again that resourcing for emergency management on reserve is inadequate, and really just want to encourage our federal colleagues to reduce the administrative burden as much as possible on communities. The need and the urgency is ever increasing with climate change, and we're just so desperate for funding and capacity. So just encouraging sustainable, predictable, and adequate funding as much as possible, and again reducing that administrative burden. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Very key points. Dale G. from SUMAS.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dale Ganzavella from SUMAS First Nation. I'm the Community Recovery Assistant.
Thank you very much. And Gilbert Vickers.
Gilbert Vickers from Sycas First Nation. I'm the fire chief for the reserve here, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to listening to see what kind of funding there is out there. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. I'll just do a quick call out. Have I missed anyone on my screen who hasn't introduced themselves? I think I've got everyone. That being said, I mentioned earlier that the session's being recorded. We will circulate a link, and we typically put them on YouTube. We have finesse recordings on there. And without any further comments, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Duncan. And Tom, let me know if you can't screen share, and I'll pull up your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Casey. And hi, everyone. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. This should work.
There we go. Perfect.
Should I? Okay, great. So yeah, I did present to the group. I think it was, Casey, maybe 3 months ago. It was a little while ago. But maybe there's some, I'm sure there's some new folks on the line for this meeting. So we're a funding source for First Nations that want to do adaptation related work in their community. And we are within the CIRNAC department. So we're a federal department. We're housed in Ottawa, but we have essentially across Canada coverage, and we basically cover all First Nations south of the 60th parallel. But to do this adaptation work in order to support communities to deal with their climate change issues that they're seeing in their communities, essentially. So let me just go to the next slide. And so I won't try to speak. You can sort of read through some of the text, but essentially we're set up for dealing with climate change, and all the different forms climate change can take, from flooding to fires, erosion. It really doesn't seem to matter. We're getting quite a range of different things, but in BC, flooding and fires seem to be the key types of impacts people are seeing and the after effects of those types of events, for example, flooding, or I should say erosion, and the need to make improvements to deal with the idea of future events happening in the communities. We would allow, or be able to support work in terms of doing assessments to help understand what those problems look like and what the degree of issue and concern and risk to those communities look like. So we're doing essentially risk assessments and engagement, ensure that communities are aware of what the problem is and that they can get together and discuss what the most appropriate solutions might be for everyone. And we're not able really to fund a lot of the actual construction of measures to protect communities, unfortunately. So we get communities understanding what the problem is, but we would help them find other funders to potentially do some sort of construction or capital works to deal with the actual physical mitigation concerns that they may have. We do have two streams of funding. One is called First Nation Adapt, which is kind of our general pot of money that can really fund any kind of type of impact. And then we have another stream that's specifically geared towards flood mapping, but it doesn't really matter. Basically, it's just we kind of deal with it as one general pot of money. And so, but that's just the sort of the structure of our funding. Just some of the details of how we would work. Like we do really want to see a community come to us with a project idea, and we work with that community on sort of coming and talking to them as where they're coming from. But we're not really expecting a final proposal, and we'll take proposals in on an ongoing basis throughout the year. We don't have a call. So we're happy to talk to people just about an idea that they may have and walk them through, the process of getting to a more final proposal that we would end up reviewing. We need a very, at some point, we want to have a clear direction. We want to know what the methodology will be, what the cost is expected to be. Not to say that communities wouldn't want to have a consultant involved in the project, which is fine, but it's up to the community to, to find that consultant and figure it out, in terms of what they want to do. We would, do almost any, like as long as it's not building anything on the ground, we can do a lot of the early phases of the work in order to understand what that piece of work needs to be in order to mitigate that issue. We just can't actually do the building of the project. So we'll, as in the middle there, we sort of do risk assessments, we do adaptation plans, recommendations, cost benefit analysis. In terms of tool development, we're kind of talking about things like PyVC or something like that, or another guide to help people understand sort of how to go about doing these kinds of risk assessments. And those key priority areas I kind of mentioned, and those are just trying to cover the base of the types of impacts that we're kind of foreseeing. But there could be others that we just haven't thought about. But drought, fire, wildfires, flooding obviously is massive, and on the shore or in the coastline, inland flooding and shoreline erosion, sea level rise for sure. So just any as long as it's a climate change related type of impact, then it'll apply to our program. So this is talking a little bit about criteria, and as long as communities are First Nation communities or they're First Nation organizations, really that's our clientele, and that's really the focus of our program. Typical sizes of programs from a cost perspective, it's really hard to give you a number, and we don't have a maximum. It's really based on what the project requirements are. We can fund either a one-year project or multi-year. So a very typical thing, really, and from the pandemic, we had so many projects get delayed, for example, and had to make them go, further than just 1 year for sure. So a typical project, I would say nowadays is probably a minimum 2 years and can be somewhat longer. We're not like thinking long term, I'd say, like we're thought, 3 or 4 years is probably the maximum. I should say too that I don't see it in the presentation so far, but we definitely encourage community participation in the project. We want community members to be involved and, for community members to be hired to be involved in the project. And so as much of the funding, stays in the community as possible. As I said already, we don't have a call for proposal at all. So we're ongoing intake. And yeah, so new proposals can be essentially submitted at any time. It's probably a little bit better though, earlier in the year, because we could run out of funds in a current fiscal year. It's possible. So, and also it's probably somewhat more predictable if you can get going earlier in the fiscal, and I mean by fiscal April 1st till March 31st, because our, the funding, as I said, may run out. We may have to tell you, like, we don't get a proposal until October, November of the year. It could be possible that we're out of funds by that point, and we'd have to delay the start of the project until the next fiscal year. But our funding is ongoing, so we're not too concerned. The worst case scenario, people may have to wait a few months before they can get started. I likely missed something, but essentially that's the end of my presentation. I kind of feel like I've gone through things pretty quickly, but I think I hit on the major items, and I think we wanted to keep this fairly short for now and leave room for questions. So if you have any questions, we could do the questions now, or we could wait till later.
Maybe we'll do them now. I see a couple hands. See, Marshan?
I was just wondering if the funding available to do projects off reserve?
Yeah, like we don't actually have to have work be done only on reserves. We sort of think of it as potentially regional type studies. For example, if it's a watershed assessment, watershed mapping project, they're often more on the traditional territory scale. And so we're very happy to cover off areas beyond the strict reserve boundaries. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We had wildfire above us, so we're interested in some assessments. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. I see Juan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, good morning again. I understand that there is not a specific call for proposals. So I wondered what kind of format our application should take. Should it be a letter of intent? Should it be a more detailed proposal? Is there any format that can be shared with us?
Yeah, I can share a template for our proposal. It's just offered up as a tool to help people understand what we're kind of looking for in the proposal. But it's not necessary that you actually use the template, but I can definitely make it available for everyone on the line.
That would be very helpful, because not that we want to be delaying the process, you're going to be receiving information that is not complete, or information that you require is not going to be available in there.
Yeah, that's why we put it together. We've been asked that question before. Like I say, it's available, and I'll send. Maybe I'll do is I'll send. We have a few templates, including our budget template, for example.
Right.
I'll make those available to Casey, and maybe we can get sent out that way.
Okay, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Any additional questions for Tom on this program? I have two, but I'll wait for community. feel free to jump in if you don't have a hand raised. Two questions I have, Tom, and I guess it also pertains to, oh, I see Quentin. I'll go after Quentin. Go ahead, Quentin.
Thanks, Casey. So what's the difference between this program and then the non-structural mitigation program with this? I don't know if Anthony wants to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, I don't feel I should comment on any of the ISC programs. I'm somewhat familiar with them, but I definitely would hold off for some of the ISC folks on the line here to comment on that. And
Yeah,
maybe we could do a compare and a contrast later.
Yeah, and I'm going to go through the NSMP in a moment, so we can do that compare and contrast.
Okay.
Perfect. Two questions I have for all the presenters, I guess, is the whole concept of Indigenous knowledge. And there's literature on kind of the state of incorporating Indigenous knowledge, blending it with Western science knowledge, especially in disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation. And quite often it's reported that we just seem to be documenting Indigenous knowledge, and that's about it. So I'm curious about how well programs are acknowledging the importance of that, you know, especially if a proposal had a budget item for that. I know with some provincial fundings, they recommend that Indigenous knowledge holders be paid commensurate with engineers and other experts. So that's the first question. And then just the other question is, if a community has a draft proposal, can they submit it for feedback just to make sure it's as well written and it has the information it needs to have? Thank you.
Well, I could start. So question one on the traditional knowledge, I should have mentioned it. I can't believe I didn't, but it's really like we would really enjoy seeing proposals that would include traditional knowledge, and we promote it. So we definitely should be including that element in my slide deck. We, for example, have projects I can think of where we're sort of doing two-eyed seeing approach, where we're doing sort of more of the idea of scientific collection of data, but we're also doing traditional knowledge collection at the same time. And then the idea is to merge those two things in the product. There's two different studies in BC that we're doing along those lines, and you know, it's kind of a new field. Like everyone's kind of a little unsure how, you know, the result will go exactly, but it's not just simply to include, you know, traditional knowledge for just the purpose of collecting traditional knowledge. It's definitely going to be used in the determination of risk in these two studies that I'm mentioning. So anyways, I think there's more work to do in that area, but we're definitely very keen on, in our program for sure, to making sure people understand that traditional knowledge can and could be included in their works that we're supporting. Drawing a blank on your second question, Casey.
Just if you share a template and a community wants to send you a draft and get feedback on it.
So, but we don't have a call, so that's kind of the real nice element of not having a call, is that we can take in drafts of proposals, and we can definitely talk to that, you know, to that community about how to improve it, what needs to be still added. No problem. And it can be for the initial time, it can just sort of be an idea that someone has, and then we'll work with them to, you know, add definition to that idea and make sure that it's compatible with our program. Essentially, we don't want people spending a whole bunch of time on something and then realize, you know, way later that it actually, you know, sorry, you know, that's something we actually can't fund, for example.
Thank you. I see Juan, you have your hand up again.
Yes, I am. I would like to know what is the amount of funding that is being allocated for this initiative, and whether if it's divided into regions or provinces. Could you please answer that question?
Yeah, we don't allocate by region. We have a total of 9 million in funding for our region would be all of Canada essentially, and we just sort of go at the idea of, you know, as proposals come in, and they get approved, then the money starts moving out of our budget, but we don't allocate funds per region. Of our 9 million right now, I think we have about 3 million allocated that have actually been spent and is kind of in the process of being flowed to communities in the current fiscal year.
Thank you. So in essence, there is $6 million available for the entire country.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I know. It's a big country for sure. And so that's just the reality.
Thank you for that. And before we go on to our next presentation, if anyone else has joined, maybe just quickly introduce yourself, your position, what kind of work you do. I see Kay Bright from Finesse. Kay, you want to introduce yourself? We can always loop back. And I don't think anyone else has joined. I think next on the agenda is the Emergency Management Assistance Program. Anthony, do you want to take it away? And you can share screen if you have a presentation. And thank you, Tom, so much for the presentation. Super appreciated.
Thanks, Casey. I'm going to try and share my screen, and you guys, if you let me know if you can see it. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, hi everybody. Again, Anthony Hadfield. I've been the regional manager of emergency management for BC ISK since February, so I'm relatively new to the program, although learned a hell of a lot in that time. Fortunately, I've got a lot of very experienced colleagues in this unit. My background, just so you know, I've been with ISK since 2010. And my background is I've always worked in the funding services area, so funding agreement management, sort of relationship management with First Nations. So I was an FSO, funding services officer, and then I was one of the FS managers. So I suppose I've got a lot of knowledge of how ISK works, and it's about trying to bring that and leverage that kind of information and to hopefully help improve our emergency management program. And you know, make it more efficient for communities. So yeah, EMAP. So first of all, our unit has grown dramatically over the last few years for obvious reasons. Obviously, going back to 2017, I think in 2017 there were just 2 members of staff that worked in the emergency management team, and prior to that, I remember back in when I first started in sort of 2010, 2011, there was 1 person. We now have 10 people working in a variety of areas on the emergency management field. And that shows you really kind of the dramatic impacts that we've seen in BC of wildfires, flooding, and obviously, you know, climate change in general. So currently, the way we're set up is we have a director who oversees the unit, and then there's an operations team, which is what I manage. And we're split into 5 regions: Northeast, Northwest, sort of Central, Southwest and Southeast are kind of one at the moment, and then Vancouver Island. And we have a program advisor for each of those regions who works directly with communities on all the areas that we work in, from preparedness and mitigation through to recovery and response. And we're almost fully staffed, which in ISK at the moment, I don't know how your organizations are. We kind of have a lot of empty boxes, but we've only got 1 of those positions that's currently empty. We've recently recruited the 4th advisor, so we have 4 out of 5 filled, which is good. We also have a recovery team because there is so much recovery work. My colleague Tim McCann, who many of you may already know, I'm actually in his position. He's kind of for a year going to be focusing more on recovery. And the big recovery projects like Lytton is a huge one, obviously, from the fires that they've experienced over the last few years. And then I think, and this reflects kind of the changes in the way, hopefully, the department's moving generally, and in the way we're trying to manage First Nation emergency management with First Nations. We also have a partnerships team who are working with our partners, and principally First Nations. Finesse, huge part of this conversation, and also the province. Obviously, we have agreements with the EMCR and with BC Wildfire Service. So that's kind of the way our unit is split at the moment, and trying to move things forward and hopefully improve things on the ground. Moving to the, it's probably not going to let me change slides here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the way we're structured is very much in line with the 4 pillars of emergency management. And basically, obviously, that's preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. And we have program dollars across all those areas. And we're there to provide funding in relation to natural hazard emergencies. So as we said, wildfires, flooding, severe weather events. And that is what we do. And so some of the other kind of events we're currently looking at is excessive snow load. That's a project we're working on. But obviously the bulk of our time has been spent on wildfires, or is spent on wildfires and flooding. So that's kind of the way we're structured in terms of those 4 areas. Now, in terms of preparedness and mitigation, so one of the issues we have in the region is that we have actually very limited budget in the region for our programming. The vast majority of our funding at the moment goes on response and recovery. And for that, we need HQ approval. Every time we have a recovery project, we have to go to Ottawa to get that funded. So at the moment, our preparedness and mitigation is quite limited, and that's one thing I've kind of learned. So we have 2 programs. The biggest, the largest of those is the non-structural mitigation program, and NSMP, and many of you may have applied for projects for this. And we have about $3.5 million in the current year for 23-24 in that pot of funding. And that it is application based, and it's a little misleading because I think on the application it says that we have to have received proposals by March the 31st, 2023, and that is misleading because we don't have actually a deadline. I don't even know why they put that on. Basically, we basically fund that program until the budget is gone, basically. So last year we were funding projects right up until the end of March in 2023, 22-23. So if you haven't put anything in yet and you've got some ideas, there's plenty of money. I think we've allocated about 1/3 of the budget so far, about $1 million. So there's still a reasonable amount of money left. One thing I want to point out is that there's by no means enough money here, and this is I wanted to come to the and again, some of you may have read the Auditor General's report that came out in 2022, sort of dissecting emergency management for First Nations. As delivered by ISC, and basically pointing out that we spend far too much money on recovery and response and recovery, and we need to spend more money up front. So my hope is that over the next little while, this preparedness and mitigation budget gets larger, that we increase that funding. And also the other pot of funding we have control of in the region is our capacity budget, and we have a shade under $2 million in that, and we use that to fund emergency management coordinators. But because we can only fund effectively 13 or 14 of those, they're basically targeted towards kind of umbrella organizations, if you like, that cover more than one First Nation. So tribal councils, for example, we were able to fund those. So NTC on the island would be an example. But again, we need more money in that area. And I think both of these programs, there needs to be an increase in funding so that we can do more preparedness, more capacity development, and more mitigation. And again, that's highlighted in that OAG report that came out last year. In the meantime, while we wait for that, we obviously manage what we have. And again, we manage this preparedness and mitigation budget in the region. So again, it's application based, eligible activities, and these are examples: creating or updating emergency plans, conducting emergency exercises, participating and running training courses. And again, I think going back to Casey's point about Indigenous knowledge, definitely build those into your plans, into your training. We definitely want to support that. And again, I think it's very much a work in progress. And I think, as Casey alluded to, it's an area that we haven't been very good at in the past. We're trying to improve. So build your knowledge into those plans and into the training. You can also use it for hazard risk and vulnerability analysis, things like floodplain mapping. We're able to purchase low dollar amounts of low dollar value pieces of equipment. So the dollar amount is up to $5,000. So I'm trying to think of some examples. So radios and walkie-talkies can be purchased through this program. And other equipment that you can, maybe laptops that can be used for managing in the case of an emergency event or preparing for an emergency. We're also able to, if you're on the coast, we're able to fund tsunami sirens as well. Some limitations. So the NSNP program is not designed as an ongoing source of funding. So we can't fund ongoing salaries, for example, for emergency coordinator positions. You can build, if you've got a specific project, you can build wages into that project, but it's designed as a kind of standalone annual project. Again, we can't fund ongoing costs. Another example I have is satellite phones. We can buy the satellite phones, if they're up to $5,000, but we're not able to pay for the ongoing kind of service costs that may be part of that. That this program can't do that. Stephen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I can wait until you're done though, Anthony.
Oh, okay. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So that's the NSNP, and again, I briefly mentioned our capacity budget as well, which we do use to fund. It's 13 or 14 emergency management coordinator positions. So response and recovery, and as I said, we don't have any budget per se in-house in the region, and over the last few years, it's been a considerable budget. We've in excess of $70 million in these kind of areas has been going out in direct response to the events that we've seen in BC. So the first thing to say in terms of response, ISK doesn't have any on the ground response capabilities. We don't have any boots on the ground, as it were. We work with and support communities in response work through the service agreements that we have with EMCR, with Emergency Management Climate Response, the BC Wild Service, and of course with Finesse and Casey's team. So though they're the kind of on the ground people who provide that capacity, we're there to support and provide funding where we can. So that's important. Often though, I mean, in terms of costs that we can cover, obviously EMCR is able to cover a lot of costs in terms of response through their own eligibility and their terms and conditions. But on occasion, there is something they can't fund. So I think ISK's, our authorities are a little broader. So it may well be that something EMCR can't fund, we can fund, and we can provide that reimbursement directly to the community. And we'll review what that cost is, and if eligible under our terms and conditions, we will reimburse it. The other thing as well, and probably slightly different to what Tom was talking about, our programs are purely limited to on reserve. We're not able to fund projects off reserve. So that is a limitation. In terms of, we also are able to provide enhanced evacuee related support. Again, this is in excess of what EMCR can provide. again, there may be some flexibility in terms of additional evacuee funding that we can provide if and when the need arises. So it might be that there are occasions when commercial accommodations and meal supports are not eligible under the province, but they may well be under us. So that's, again, I think that's an important thing to note. In terms of recovery, and again, this is where obviously the bulk of I was talking about the advisors that we have earlier, the bulk of their kind of daily work is involved in these kind of projects at the moment. And obviously we're still dealing with kind of the aftermath of the 2017, 2018 fires. The atmospheric river, of course, was a huge issue back in the back end of 2021. So my team are heavily involved in those recovery projects, and there are some big projects. We have some big housing projects that are direct recovery projects that EMAP is able to fund because there is a direct result of an event, an emergency event, as opposed to what community infrastructure funds. So some of those are in the multi-millions, and the Lytton, obviously, recovery project there is a huge project that's again as a direct result of the fires that have devastated that community over the last few years. So we'll work closely with First Nations to support on reserve recovery through EMAP, and we'll work closely with our partners. We work very closely again with Finesse and with the province on those projects. Now, one thing that we are able to do, ISC has what we call a Build Back Better policy. So we're able to, I don't know if there was a building that was there prior to a fire, say, and I don't know, it was maybe it was designed in the 1980s. We won't just replace the building that was there in the 1980s. We will upgrade it and build back better. So we'll provide the building and we'll try and make it more resilient to future emergencies that may happen. And obviously it will be built to current codes. So that's another thing that's come in over the last few years as well. I mean, as I said as well, HQ is the final financial authority. We have to get any funding authority any project that we want to get funded in the region. It first of all has to go for our regional director general, and then it goes to Ottawa, and they do generally a quick review to assess its eligibility. And usually the turnaround's pretty quick on those. Within a week, we get those back. But they hold the purse strings. We don't hold them in the region. The other thing is the recovery, the program is restricted to infrastructure and people, not the impacts of the land. So that's another distinction to be aware of. Sorry, I've skipped ahead here. I've talked a lot about the partnership as well. So again, we have a partnerships team, and all our areas of emergency management are involved to some extent in this because we work closely with our partners. But we do have a team that's specifically working on the funding agreements and work plans that we have. So there is a tripartite memorandum of understanding on emergency management between the First Nations Leadership Council, ISC, and the province of BC. Trying to make sure that First Nations are leading and are full partners in emergency management in BC. We do, ISC, obviously, as I said earlier, we don't have boots on the ground. We have service agreements, principally with the province through EMCR, who provide our 24/7 emergency response capability. So if there's an emergency that happens, a wildfire or a flood, the first port of call is to their 1-800 number. And they then obviously set that response in motion. So we have an agreement with them to provide that service along with some other things. They also coordinate that support in terms of the initial response, and then are involved in the recovery as well afterwards. And we also have agreements with BC Wildfire Service for wildfire suppression on reserve. And we do have agreements, it's not on here, but we do have an agreement with Finesse to provide services. This being a good example. So we do have an agreement of that. So that kind of gives you, and again, it's kind of from 30,000 feet. Obviously we could get down into the weeds a lot more, but that gives you a bit of an overview of how the EMAP program is sort of set up in BC. Again, if you've got any questions after that come to you, or you want contacts, that is our, we have a duty officer 24/7 telephone and email box, which is we basically review it on an ongoing basis. So any issues can be sent there, and also give them my contact details as well, my email and my telephone. So again, happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I see Stephen first and then followed by Juan.
Great. Thank you for the presentation, Anthony. I'm glad you mentioned the AG report from 2022.
Yeah.
And as well as the tripartite MOU on emergency management. I guess just being honest, I don't feel like we're full partners as coming from a community perspective in that tripartite agreement with Canada and EMCR. I think, you know, we need to think about this from a government to government perspective. And particularly for LACAML, like we're self-governing under land code, right? So we're exercising our jurisdiction, but you know, we don't have that core support, I guess. And you know, I really feel for some of our emergency program staff who you know, we can only hire on, you know, 6 to 12 month contracts, you know, and their future employability is really uncertain because of this application-based funding model that we have. So I just really want to advocate that we for especially for staff salary, that should be an eligible expense, and we need to move away from this kind of funding dependent model, and nations are desperate for core operational funding for emergency management, because we can't raise taxes like municipalities to pay for these staff. But you know, we have a fiduciary obligation to our community, as does our council, as does Canada. So I just think, you know, yeah, I just really want to advocate for that. A fundamental paradigm shift is needed in how emergency management funding is delivered to communities. And for me, like in lands and land code, we have that core operational funding that's usually signed in 3 to 5 year increments with Canada, you know, that really gives us that stability we need to exercise our self-governing authority. And for me, emergency management is part of our self-governing authority. So just wanted to share those thoughts, but otherwise, thanks for the presentation.
No, thank you, Stephen. And what you say, I mean, again, I've only been in the position like 4 months, and I've heard it many times from communities. And again, and that's why I wanted to stress it in the present. I don't want to gloss over it. It's very much a work in progress. I'd like to think we can move quickly, and more funding can be put into that. Again, I mean, you know how sometimes how the federal government works, it can be pretty slow. But I mean, certainly we would like to see more of that in the region as well. And again, we're conscious. I mean, we have 200 First Nations in BC. You know, we have a third of the First Nations across the country, and most of them would want some kind of EM capacity in-house, understandably, especially as most of our communities are pretty remote as well. So kind of self-sufficient in that respect. So thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Thank you, Stephen. Juan, I see your hand raised.
Yes, thank you again, Casey. Thank you for the presentation, Anthony. First of all, I would like to echo the comments made by Stephen. It is long overdue that the federal government of this country recognizes that emergency management is an area of practice that is equal or more important than all the other funding program areas, meaning education, lands departments, and all the activities that we are engaging. Without having a strong emergency management department, all the other departments become completely inactive, mute, and unable to deliver services. So that's my first comment. My second comment has to do with the fact that Anthony acknowledged that there is a deadline on the IMA proposals, which we scrambled to meet because it's always hurry up and wait game. We have about a couple of weeks to produce a proposal and send them over. Then months goes by and there is no answer, and then suddenly, when there is an answer, Anthony, the department brings a number of very detailed questions that we try to answer, and the same questions are repeated. My final comment has to do with the fact that I appreciate the fact that the federal government of this country is allocating funding to reserved areas. That's fine and dandy. That doesn't mean that communities cannot work with our neighbors. We, in my community, we have an all society approach to deal with emergency management. That means that we enter into agreements with the regional district of Bulklin Chaco to conduct a 2-year hazard risk and vulnerability analysis. And when we present another proposal the next year, as we have to do year by year, we are questioned as to why we are including those activities in the next year. Well, the answer is pretty simple. You don't conduct a regional hazard risk and vulnerability analysis in a month, 2 months, or a year. It takes 2 years. And then we have to provide that information to the community and inform the community and engage the community in the result of that work. So I think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in Indigenous Services Canada to realize that we are professionals, to realize that we are a group of highly committed people, that we work under a lot of stress, and we don't need the other stress of bureaucracy.
I mean, again, you raised some of the points that Stephen did, Juan, and I don't disagree with that. In terms of the asking of questions, and again, this is part of the problem with having it as proposal sort of driven funding rather than kind of a regular stream of funding. There is it's a pretty strict. It's pretty strict in terms of what's eligible and what isn't. So sometimes if an application isn't clear, that's when we'll get that's when questions will be asked, because we obviously still have to adhere to the authorities in terms of the funding authority, as in that, so the program officer has to ensure that it kind of meets the criteria. So again, that is, you could argue that's a weakness of proposal-based funding. So yeah, but I take your points. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Anthony. I have a few questions. If there's no more questions from community, if there is, just feel free to jump in. A couple of things, and part of it is just a bit of clarification, Anthony. When we talk about not paying for positions per se, and yet there could be wages built in for kind of coordinating the activities. So I always think when I've helped write an application to, say, do an emergency plan, rather than having a kind of a high price consultant do it, have someone in community do it, have someone do a lot of the other activities. So I think that's really great. Community capacity, though I fully realize it's just annually based. So I like it that you mentioned that. The low value equipment, just to confirm, that's $5 per item, not 5,000 overall.
5,000, yeah. There is a little bit of scope. We can go a bit higher. I think on some of the satellite phones, there's a little bit of leeway there, and you can always make an argument as to why. There may be some more rationale needed, but the general rule of thumb is $5,000.
And it's nice to see a tsunami siren, because when you look at the siren, the controls, the power pole, the electricity connection, it's quite expensive. I wanted to talk a little bit about the MASS concept, the multi-agency support team concept. Any First Nation can request that for response, recovery, mitigation, even before an event. And nations can request EMCR, ISK, FNHA, finesse on there. They can give situation reports to everyone online, have decision makers there who could respond to funding questions, unmet needs, as well as supports that, say, FNHA may be able to provide or finesse. So I personally think the MAST approach is a sound one during events and even before an event. Say if you see a slow moving event coming, it never hurts to have a call. I wanted to chat a little bit about GIS mapping for 911 services. We have our next generation 911 Indigenous information session, I think on July 11th. And I understand ISK will also cover 911 mapping. There are enhanced 911 mapping requirements if a community wishes to benefit from next generation 911. And I just wanted to confirm that that's an eligible expense for proposal to ISK. Would that be through the NSMP?
I believe so, yes. That would be something that would be under that mapping.
Perfect. And then just the last one is it possible to have a list of the EMAP staff in the Pacific region, and especially those that are assigned in different regions? I think that might be helpful for communities.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, if Quentin, is that a legacy hand with your hand up?
Yes. So my question is, how many times can a First Nation apply for the NSMP? From my understanding, EMAP is a one-time funding source. But as far as the NSMP, how many times can we submit applications?
Oh yeah, you can continually submit them. Yeah, I mean, we won't fund the same project multiple years. Yeah, yeah, you can do multiple projects.
Okay.
There's no limit.
And then I do want to kind of touch back on my first question when Tom was presenting, as far as what is the difference between pretty much his source of funding and then the source of funding with ISK. Because it sounds like that ISK can not only deliver the assessments, but can help mitigate some of the things found in the assessments, where the other program is just the assessments.
I mean, I don't know. And Tom, it may be, I mean, your assessment, did you say you could do your assessments off reserve? Because that would be a distinction.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of overlap. That's one thing I think that's unique. There's not too many programs out there that overlap maybe as much as First Nation Adapt and non-structural mitigation program does. But I was taking notes. I've heard from EMAP on that program a few times, and I'm always a little bit, what do they do exactly? And so it's good to get an update on that too. Like one thing, I guess the difference might be that we are looking for some sort of climate related impact, so like we're going to need some sort of indication in the proposal that there's an interest in the community to think about climate change and think about, how, if you're doing an assessment, for example, what's the projected risk look like, not only tomorrow, but, like 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now. So that's one subtle difference, but yeah. And one thing I noted too, Anthony, was that you were saying, the mitigation element. So you sort of you have more different types of things you guys can do. We're really on the assessment as that was just mentioned before. I think there may be a few other things, but there's certainly lots of overlap. And one thing I would consider, I mean, we've done this already with EMAP on other projects, but we actually co-funded together on things, you know, so that's with Tim, for example, Anthony, I was involved in some projects in the lower mainland that we funded together. So I'd very much be keen on that idea, and on the idea of no wrong door, one window approach. We're really definitely keen on, you know, seeing if we can make things smoother for communities in order for them to understand and not to be going down the wrong road anywhere if they're looking for this kind of funding.
Thank you for that. It brings to mind, Anthony, if there's a mass call that a community requests, and it's, you know, it could be 4 pillars that hopefully that the ISK rep there will be mindful of, you know, inviting, say, CIRNAC as needed if they could bring something to the table and add to it.
Okay, I'll make a note of that. That's a good point.
Thank you very much. We're halfway through our allotted time, and thank you very much, Anthony, for presenting. Thank you for the wonderful questions and comments from community. I'd like to turn it over to Rochelle Ormond, and you can screen share if you have a presentation.
Thanks, Casey. All right, I'm attempting to screen share. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm used to working with Teams. Okay, it's showing now.
Perfect.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thanks. Yeah, and actually it's Rachel. Casey, sorry, it spelled like Rochelle. So I won't expect everyone to remember because it is spelled that way. I'm a senior engineer in the Specialist Services Unit of Community Infrastructure, and many of you may have worked with Brent Barron before. So he retired at the end of April, and I've picked up the structural mitigation portfolio since he's gone. And I'd also like to give regrets from my manager, who's Ananthan Sapaya. So he is the manager of Specialist Services. And then our director has changed in the last year. So our new director is Avril Lamont. So just wanted to kind of start off with what is structural mitigation. We've talked about non-structural, we've talked about the different programs, and just wanted to make sure we're all thinking of the same thing when we talk about structural mitigation. And because there is some flexibility in the program, I don't want to say that there's a hard and fast rule about what structural mitigation can be. So wanted to also talk about the different types of projects that we're working on. In an ideal world, structural mitigation would take place before an event happens. So before the flooding, before the sea level rise. And basically it's the use of infrastructure to prevent damage. So here we're thinking about flooding, and also often sea level rise. So thinking about shoreline erosion. As we saw during the atmospheric river event, a lot of communities, not just First Nation communities, weren't prepared. The appropriate infrastructure wasn't in place, or we've also been seeing, because of climate change, that maybe the infrastructure was appropriate, but now it needs to be upgraded. So we've been looking at a lot of different types of projects, both before and after that event. Sometimes it's house raising, sometimes house relocation. Many communities already had protective dikes, but those dikes were breached. So we've been looking at both construction and upgrade, and shoreline protection also is becoming a lot of projects for shoreline protection are of interest because BC has so many coastal nations. So that often can be riprap placement. And the structural mitigation projects that we fund looks at all different levels. So we'll look at assessment, and that might include computer modeling. So what would the river flood levels be? What are the flow patterns? What is the new expected sea level? And then we also can provide funding for the other stages, so design and construction. And I'll talk in more detail about that funding. So the reason that the First Nation Infrastructure Fund was brought in was to help First Nations with particular infrastructure concerns that aren't covered through the other capital programs. So there's always been the major capital program funding with water treatment, wastewater, but then there's other concerns. So the other community infrastructure program, and that includes, for example, fire and solid waste. And then what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the structural mitigation component. So structural mitigation sits in the FNIF program. In the past, a lot of the time, the ways that these projects would get into ISK's funding streams was through FNIP, but that's not necessary now. There have been changes with FNIP, so it's more optional. It's not required every year. So we are also just learning about projects and concerns simply by talking with First Nations as well. So the structural mitigation program sits in the Community Infrastructure Directorate. And that means that there's a similar process for funding to capital projects. So if you also work on roads or water type projects, we use the same type of framework. So looking at the same kind of application process where we ask for specific funding requests. So we have a template for the feasibility stage, the design stage, the construction stage. And then we also have similar capital restrictions. So we do try to focus on reserve projects, but because the FNIF has a bit more flexibility, we can look at off reserve if there's certain requirements are met. So one of those requirements is cost sharing, and that there's a significant benefit to the First Nation, and that there's an appropriate rationale in the project. So I'll talk a bit more in the next slide about cost sharing, but what we found with many of the projects is we're looking at watershed level impacts. So you can't just look at one section of the river, because whatever you do will have, as you know, will have impacts both upstream and downstream. And for many communities that are sitting at the base of a mountain, it's the up mountain concerns that we need to assess and address at the reserve level. So we do have a number of projects where we are funding some assessment off reserve. Where it gets a little more tricky is when the actual mitigation work is off reserve. And then I just also wanted to mention that although I'm talking about infrastructure-based solutions, there are also nature-based solutions. This is not quite the same as the non-structural mitigation, but for all of you working with waterways, you know that it's important to think about habitat and keeping the river natural. So we are working with NRCan and a number of other groups to also look at putting in mitigations that will promote that diversity of habitat and actually be good for the river. So sometimes these mitigations can actually improve the river. And I keep saying river, but I'm also meaning coastal as well. Okay, so in terms of prioritizing, as Anthony mentioned, we do have a lot of First Nations in BC, and most of the First Nations are very close to water, whether it's an estuary, the coast, or a river. So I would say almost every First Nation likely has some kind of a concern. So we do have a method of prioritizing. So looking at what's the likelihood of the hazard occurring. We're also looking at infrastructure impacts. So if there's land that doesn't have any housing or other buildings on it, that's likely going to be a lower priority than, for example, if housing is at risk. But we also consider loss of land when we're looking at these priorities. We look at the population that might be affected. So how many people live there, and also cost sharing. So if a project can be cost shared, then that makes it easier to support the project for ISK. And this isn't to say that low priority project isn't important. It's purely that we don't have enough funds to support every project that is necessary. So funding, cost sharing, often necessary, and we've talked about it quite a bit as well, how First Nation Adapt and also EM work together. And within the structural mitigation program, sometimes we can partner with, especially with First Nation Adapt. That just makes the dollars stretch farther. And then because of the multi-stakeholders in all of the projects, or many of the projects, we've also partnered with the province. We can partner with Infrastructure Canada and sometimes First Nations. Often what this means is ISK can help support the feasibility and design stages of the project so that the project gets to that shovel-ready stage where a DMAF application can be made. Since the atmospheric river event, there have been a lot of changes to funding. So structural mitigation historically has been quite underfunded as a program. When the atmospheric river happened, there were, I think it was billions of dollars worth of damages. And the federal government realized that this is a risk that has to be addressed. So since then, we have been receiving more funding. So we have targeted funding for structural mitigation of about $10 million for this year. And that is, I think, a 5 to 10-fold increase from previous years. We also have just the regular A-based capital funding. And because our director realizes that there are so many projects that are priorities to First Nations, she's also planning to allocate a larger amount of that A-based funding to structural mitigation and then in past years. And we do have a number of high priority projects that we've been working with communities on that would have a high construction cost. So we've been doing special submissions to headquarters to try and get approval for that funding. I think that sorry, I'm just gonna back through the slides because there was something I wanted to speak about that I did not. I guess just more about, sorry, how to contact us and how to start the projects. So we are proposal based, similar to other funding. But that said, you don't have to prepare a complete proposal and submit it. What's really encouraged is to reach out to myself, to my manager, or to the capital management officer or senior engineer that you regularly work with and discuss the concerns, because there's so many different pieces to a lot of these projects and often multiple stakeholders. We can help pathfind if the structural mitigation program can't cover everything. Maybe we can help you to find other funders. I also discuss projects with Tom and Anthony, so we can work together to try and get projects funded. After discussing the concerns, then I can help you figure out, should you submit to ISK or should you maybe go to FN Adapt first, or is there another agency? So just really want to emphasize that please reach out and we will do our best to help you with the project. I think that's it for me. Thanks. I can answer questions.
Thank you, Rachel. If people have questions, you want to raise your hand? I think your presentation was so clear.
Yeah, I hope so. That means it was either very informative or not informative.
I have more of a comment than a question. I know with some of the provincial funding programs that I've been involved in discussing the program guides for eligibility. I ask First Nations to kind of monitor for program announcements because the issue of First Nations owned infrastructure, even if it's off Indian Reserve and presumably off modern treaty settlement lands, may be eligible. So when a new program funding comes out in a program guide, we will do our best to support awareness raising of that. But it's nice to see some of the provincial programs saying that the First Nation, if it owns infrastructure off reserve, it's eligible, which is great to see. Are there any questions? We're well ahead of schedule, which is fine. And if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank each and every one of the presenters for making the time and the PowerPoints. The recording will be on our YouTube website, and we'll share a link, and we'll share the presentations and the documents. We're also going to try to modify our Finesse website to have information and materials up there. So if no one would like the last word, I wish you all a great day and have a fabulous long weekend. And I super appreciate all the work that each and every one of you does.
Thanks, Casey. You have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.